At first thought, you might think that cities, for example, at the same latitude would have essentially the same tides, but nothing could be further from the truth, because the tidal forcing is really only half of the answer to what it is that makes tides in a specific location. The second part of that answer is the local ocean response to that specific tidal forcing.
And in some places around the world, we find that tides have a diurnal component that is very strong, and this means that we have one high tide and one low tide per day. This occurs often on the east coast of the United States. In other areas, such as here in Santa Barbara, we have what's called a mixed tide, where both the diurnal or daily tidal components and the semi-diurnal tidal components, these are twice-a-day tides, are both strong enough that we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day.
Tidal currents, which are movements of water related to the tides, also vary according to location.
If we think of the tidal motions, the up and down motions, as a phenomenon related to the wave nature of tides, there is also a motion of water associated with that. In short, tidal currents occur everywhere and all the time, wherever you have a tide. Tidal currents can be very important in constricted passages. One of those examples, even where the tide is small, was in Aristotle's consternation in trying to figure out what the tidal currents were through the Greek Isles. Because of the constrictions, even though the tides aren't very large, we can have significant currents. On the other hand, in areas like the ocean off of California, we have relatively weak tidal currents because there's really no constriction.
The tide is slow, 1 cycle per day, 2 cycles per day, and the flow of water is not constricted, so you get currents of a few centimeters a second at most in the open ocean. But as soon as you run it up into a continental shelf and then on into estuaries or harbors or channels, then it has to speed up.
Tidal currents in constrictions are important. They are important, and they are regularly mapped and used by mariners in entrances, bay entrances, New York Harbor, San Diego Bay, San Francisco Bay, the Straits of Juan de Fuca in Seattle. Tidal currents are a very important phenomenon in those constrictions, and they're important for shipping still today.
When you live near the ocean and you want to take a boat out of some harbors, you're limited by tidal currents. If I were in Woods Hole, at spring tide, the current velocity through the so-called hole gets up to 7 knots, and you may have a problem manipulating it, so that in that sense, tidal currents are a factor in coastal areas and may dictate how you can get in and out of harbors. That certainly is a major consideration.
While the effects of the tides within harbors and other constricted areas have long been recognized, the impact of tidal processes extends to many other areas within the marine environment.
For example, during storm activity, if high waves and storm impact on coastlines occurs, especially on the west coast, during the time of very high tides, then coastal erosion and coastal flooding can be much more of a problem than if those same storms occur during either periods of low tide or during periods of lower tidal range.
Perhaps nowhere is the impact of the tides more significant than at the appropriately named intertidal zone.
The intertidal zone is that area of the shoreline that is exposed during the tides. The area along this beach will be submerged by water part of the day and exposed to the air part of the day. The actual features of the intertidal zones will change as the tides change daily within the lunar cycle. As the tides are influenced by both the gravity pull on the Earth's surface by the moon and the sun, the exact position of high tide and low tide will change within that lunar cycle. If you were an organism living within the intertidal zone, you have the complications of being exposed to air. In the summertime, extreme heat. In the wintertime, extreme cold.
The marine organisms, both the fauna and the flora, have to have evolved survival mechanisms such that at one part of the day they're snugly wrapped in the warm water of the surface. They're getting nutrients, they're getting the oxygen they need, and then all of a sudden the water goes away, and now they're exposed to the drying effects of air, to the stronger effects of sunlight, and so they have had to evolve mechanisms to survive these essentially daily droughts and that occur in their life cycle. So the tides have made a big impact on creatures in the coastal zone.
For some organisms in the intertidal zone, the role played by tidal currents is even more direct.
They move out the eggs of the critters that live in the coastal zone, take them out to sea where they develop, and then bring them back into the coastal zone where they settle down again. The tides also remove pollutants. All these plants and animals in the coastal zone are generating waste products, and the currents come in and wash those away, bringing in fresh water with more nutrients.
In some coastal regions, the tides affect not only the organisms which reside there, but the shape and dimensions of the entire area.
For example, some tidally dominant estuaries, such as those on the north coast of Australia, are characterized by significant tidal ranges and by sediment moving into and out of them with each tide, and being shaped essentially as almost funnel-shaped estuaries by that tidal regime. The Thames estuary in southeast England is essentially a tidally dominated estuary because you have a tidal range there of 5 to 8 meters or so, and this pushes the tidal bore into the river mouth a considerable distance upstream, and then of course it returns seawards a few hours later. And this creates a very distinctive type of river mouth.
Tidal motions are sometimes viewed from a very different perspective, as when satellites like the Topex Poseidon collect ocean surface data high above planet Earth.
One of the goals was to measure the ocean tides in unprecedented accuracy and coverage. The interesting thing is that the ocean topography mission like Topex Poseidon was not necessarily interested in tides, but we have to understand tides to remove that as a noise. Otherwise, the sea surface topography we measure is going to be dominated by tidal motions. So you have to remove that before you see smaller signals like El Nino and Gulf Stream and things like that.
One of the big problems in trying to sort out trends in past sea level changes, global sea level changes, has been the inability to measure sea level at lots of places over the ocean. Almost all of the sea level measurements that we rely on to talk about global change, global sea level increases, come from the tide gauge networks that are located on coastlines and on a very few mid-ocean islands, like Hawaii, for example. So there has been a renewed interest in a very old subject, namely the study of tides, as a necessity to remove this tidal signal, open ocean tidal signal, from these satellite measurements.
Another link between tides and global climate is a function of tidal friction.
Tidal friction arises from the interaction of the water movements caused by the tides with the bottom.
Very important.